Trevor, good to see you. One potentially last time, or at least the last time to talk about Camus.
Yeah, that's right. We're wrapping the book up today, and we'll see where we go from here.
Indeed so. And after what has been, I think, a very exhilarating, fast-paced thriller, this last part does not have quite the drama, although there are still some very important moral considerations. The novel comes to a conclusion. Some of the basic plot themes that emerge are that the gates are finally opened in early February, that effectively the plague has been managed. Maybe there's still a handful of cases, but the number of cases are such that the city officials are able to determine that the city can reopen. Everyone is elated. There are many reunions happening all over the city. And even in the midst of that joy, there are still some deaths. This will be our only spoiler alert, but I think anybody who's gotten this far with our podcast will know what's going on. But we lose a few more important characters, including Theroux, as well as Madame Rieux, Bernard Rieux's spouse.
Yeah, and indeed, Theroux is potentially the last plague victim. One almost gets the sense that, as is described in the book, both forms of the plague, the pneumonic and the bubonic, find themselves in Theroux's body, and his death is sort of the final struggle with which at least this iteration or manifestation of the plague in Iran will emerge and die out with his passing as well.
And along with those two final deaths, we see Cottard have a kind of mental break. We'll talk about that briefly. And Rambert is finally reunited with his wife. And obviously there's more going on, but I think the biggest bombshell for anybody who has been reading along and avoided their Wikipedia searches, you learn that Bernard Rieux has been the narrator the whole time.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, one almost or maybe had the sense that that was the case, whether it is a surprise or not. And this is something we've discussed sort of off air, wondering why this device was used, and might it have been more effective if it was someone else, or, or revealed in a different way, I think is an interesting question for readers to consider. I mean, what was Camus' intention here?
Off air, you and I had discussed who was potentially the narrator, and I had posited that perhaps it would have been Theroux, given his notes, and he was using his own notes as well as conversations with others, or maybe even if it was Grand himself, who could not write a fictional novel but was somehow able to meticulously narrate the details because of his acuity working with the statistics during the sanitation squad in the very thick of the plague. So
yeah, and I think your suggestion there would have made actually for a very interesting twist. I mean, a lot of readers find this to be sort of anticlimactic, that, it is Rieux who sort of seems like the main character from the outset, and he's also the narrator. But juxtaposing the difficulty that Grand has with writing the fictional tract versus possibly writing this chronicle of history with its various sources in a quasi-objective way, let's say, might have been more compelling. But he still got the Nobel Prize.
Indeed, right, yeah. So, who are we to critique somebody who has a Nobel Prize? Camus, sorry, you blew it. You could have had a better twist for us. But I think there is some relevance to it. We'll get to it at the end, but there is something to be said for why it's Rieux. And I think a lot of it turns on how we want to read Rieux, as we've been discussing for some time. I'm not entirely convinced that Rieux has gone through much of a moral conversion. He may not even be the main character, or at least if he is, I don't know if he's the person that we are to look to emulate. And so maybe there is something to be said for, you finally get that information at the very end, and Rieux himself reveals to us that he decided in a specific moment to become the narrator and write this account. And so he gets his moral conversion possibly only after all of these events have occurred.
Yeah, it has been a question of some interest for both of us, whether Rieux, to the extent that he seems like the main character, is in fact the voice or the moral exemplar for Camus, the voice of Camus, or the moral exemplar that he wants us to look to. And there is this curious thing to think about, I guess, in the sense that he is one of the exemplary actors in terms of, as we've discussed repeatedly, helping others, doing his duty, especially administering to the sick through the plague. Not the most reflective character, one who sort of puts theory and theorizing, certainly of a grand kind, aside, and yet he's also the chronicler. So he's something of a historian and a doctor without maybe being the philosopher and the theologian. And so it's just another way of suggesting that, as we've said before, that all of these characters represent something but are perhaps missing other things. And so maybe that's what we want to wonder at. What are each of them missing for the good that they may have? And the exemplary virtues that they may provide us, where are they lacking? What are they lacking? And what is Camus suggesting by the lacunae in their characters?
I think that's a pretty good summary of some of the things to consider here, because if Rieux himself is a historian but not a philosopher, a historian but not a theologian, there might be something that we need to consider in terms of whether or not a raw empiricism is really enough, right? And so I think, especially now, even more so today than at the time Camus was writing, we live in an age in which we tend to look at science and scientists as being the chieftains of society. I mean, even in the midst of our own pandemic, everybody wants to know what science tells us, what science tells us, what science tells us. But science itself is not an actor. It's actually a process. It's a method. And people need to work through that. And there are questions that science actually cannot answer. And you only need to read philosophy and theology and political theory to realize that there are genuine questions that are outside of the domain for which science itself, if we can think of science, capital S, science, as having the authority to speak on all matters. And so that might be what Camus is at least hinting at or suggesting that we at least consider.
And especially when it comes to, as we dove into last time, especially when it comes to the problem or question of evil, the poignancy of this novel depicting a plague that represents many things, as we've discussed, from the medical disease itself to the possibilities of moral and political corruption, tyranny, totalitarianism, and the like, signify that this is not only a recurring problem, but one that cannot be solved. And it's an irresolvable problem. And so these fundamental, recurring, irresolvable, intractable problems are the very ones that science of the kind that you're describing cannot solve. We need something more than science to prudentially engage and act and respond in the midst of these kinds of crises, and they will continue to recur. So, having raised Rieux and discussed, of course, and examined his character over the podcast, now that we've reached the end, I wanted to press you a little further on a thesis, an interesting proposition that you raised, that Rieux represents some kind of moral flatness or a flatness of soul, a kind of morality that is not maybe the most robust or fullest. Now that we've reached the end and seen his response to the death of potentially his closest friend, as well as the death of his wife, what more might we say about this, or could you maybe flesh that thesis out a little more?
Something I've been thinking about while reading this novel, and again, I'll preface my comments by reminding listeners and scholars of Camus that this is the only work of Camus that I've read, and so there could be other pieces of evidence, maybe in Camus' notebooks or other readings, that would suggest that Camus himself was working towards a different thesis. However, when you just read the text of The Plague and think through the lack of moral conversion or the lack of learning that occurs with Rieux, he is in a lot of ways ambivalent to almost all of the great tragedies that befall him. And that seems to be part of his character, I know. But when Theroux dies, it's a really harrowing, depressing moment. I think many readers tear up during this point. His death is narrated with the same kind of intensity as the death of the young boy from the previous part. We really come, obviously, to have sympathized with Theroux, and we want to see him recover like everyone else. And when you realize that it's not going to happen, it's really heartbreaking. But Rieux reacts with a false stoicism. He is unmoved by that death. He remarks that he acknowledges that there's a kind of lost opportunity for friendship, of coming to know each other more fully and more completely. And so there's regret about some future deepening of the friendship that's lost, but there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of wherewithal or drama or sadness in Rieux over this death, which is not to say that we expect him to lose his mind and become hysterical and sob, because that would have been uncharacteristic, but it's still nevertheless a flat response that we get. And almost immediately after Theroux's death, we see a telegram come in over the death of Madame Rieux, and again, it's the same kind of flat response. What does he do when he reads the text? He just stares out into the window, looking at the mountains, presumably in the direction of where she was. We learned that she had passed a week prior, and it simply took that long for the information to reach him. When Rieux's mother comes in and learns of the news, Rieux says, "Don't cry about it, Mom. Of course it's sad, but we expected it." And again, he's trying to exert a false stoicism on this, of being unmoved by this thing that's obviously deeply moving and deeply tragic for anyone to go through that experience of losing their spouse in a way in which they not only had no control over it, but obviously could not have been there in the moment. And we see yet again one more time, and even involving Rieux's relationship with his own own mother, there's a telling passage on page 291 that he knows that his mother loves him, but he can't come to express even the love to his own mom. And so again, there's something wrong with Rieux in the responses that he gives to things that common sense would suggest that you would get a little bit of a different response, a little bit more affection in the response, something. Now, in some ways, I think this is consistent with Rieux. He focuses on what ought to be done. He said to Theroux that he sympathizes with the victims. Nothing is out of character, but there's something wrong with that kind of character that we're exposed to. I don't know that it's a thoroughgoing rejection on Camus' part of this character, but he nevertheless is a flawed character, and we need to be mindful of that.
Well, I think there are certainly some contradictions and some flaws, as you say, with Rieux, and these are worth considering. And the question of his inability to show and express love is an interesting one, and I want to comment on that. But the response to Theroux's death is, I think, your characterization perhaps a little unjust. I mean, he does say that, it's narrated here, that when the end came, the tears that blinded Rieux's eyes were tears of impotence, right? And he did not see Theroux roll over, face the wall, and die with a short hollow groan, as if somewhere within him an essential chord had snapped. He's crying, he's grieving, and in fact, I think that the characterization of the tears as tears of impotence gives us some insight into part of Rieux's response, right? It's that here, yet again, the doctor, the one with the ability to heal, cannot save the dear friend before him, helpless in this struggle, in this stormy struggle that, as you rightly say, is sort of characterized in similar, colorful, and harrowing language as the death of the young boy was. Theroux's death here is indeed a great shock and cutting down of the doctor, helpless, impotent, unable to do anything more, and it brings home for him this absurd situation of death. All their struggles, all their good works, and in the end, what? The death of his friend. And so maybe it is surprising, though, his response to the death of his wife, and one wonders, is this simply the response of exhaustion, another death? And maybe it's juxtaposing the death of the proximate friend with the death of the abstract wife, or the wife who's removed. And I think, you characterized early on or commented earlier on in one of our first podcasts that, there is something strange about this relationship between the doctor and his wife. And so whatever their marriage was like or wasn't like is maybe part of the problem. But this question of Rieux's relationship to love is important. And as after Theroux's death, after his wife's death, he goes on this walk, on this stroll through the city, and he's observing the people of Iran who are, on the one hand, engaging in merriment, almost happily forgetting about the past. And this is something of a shock to Rieux, but it's something he comes to slowly understand, that, happiness is what many of these people were always longing for. Their exile was from a happiness, or the distant homeland of happiness. They were immigrants who longed to return to happiness. You might not be able to call this happiness peace, but it is something that all people, all humans, Rieux suggests, are really longing for. And this happiness for Rieux, as he comes to see it, as it becomes clearer for him, is that which is found, as he says, in the custody of love on page 299. And it was to this, their lost home, toward happiness, they longed to return, turning their backs disgustedly on all else. And ultimately, on the next page, 300, Rieux suggests that now he knows the answer. He says, the answer is found in these people who are united in human love. They knew now that if there is one thing one can always yearn for and sometimes attain, it is human love. The strange thing is that Rieux is unable to express his love for his wife, unable to build love in his own home, in his marriage, had in fact encouraged Rambert earlier to pursue romantic love, can't find the words for it properly, but somehow knows that this is the one thing that you can rely on. Meaning of a grander kind ought not to be striven for, but the hope for human love in marriage among lovers of one kind or another is perhaps the only foundation for any sort of goodness or happiness that can be found. And he's deprived of it. It's a curious contradiction that he's the guy who didn't want to theorize before, but now has some sort of theoretical insight into the importance of love, and yet cannot, in fact, express his love even towards his mother, and otherwise live this love that he now sees as important.
That more or less seems right to me. I do think there's nevertheless more evidence, or maybe even a stronger case, about the limits of why we want to read Rieux as more sympathetically. I think, as you mentioned, Rieux cried when Theroux finally passed. He goes for a stroll. He has these insights. As we learn, is the narrator, and we learn on the very concluding page that it was through all these walks, through the incident with Cottard, which we'll discuss in a moment, that Rieux resolved to write this chronicle. And the narrator says, quote, and now we know this is Rieux writing, so that he should not be one of those who hold their peace, but should bear witness in favor of those plague-stricken people. And I took that to mean that whatever moral conversion or filling out or expanding moral worldview that occurs in Rieux happens after these events of the plague. It's only at the very end. Whereas where we see the other moral conversions happening in real time, Rambard being, I think, the chief exemplar of that in his decision to stay in the town. We see others like Cottard who are unable to come around to a new way of living. For Rieux, whatever's happening is happening after, or it's only in this final moment that he's having his own awakening, and it's a story that's going to be unfinished because we don't see what he does. But nevertheless, I mean, one final point for thinking about this more clearly, and what I was thinking about, as we'll learn in an incident with Cottard, as Cottard is being carried off by the police, he passes by his friend Rieux. And what does Rieux do? He turns away. He can't look at his friend being hauled off. He doesn't have the courage to look him in the eye as he's being hauled off.
Yeah, I mean, I'm still sympathetic to your thesis that there's something flatter or less than grand about the character Rieux. I just wonder what's really happening with respect to his, as you call it, a moral conversion. I mean, it's almost as though his conversion or his insight or his realization by the end is that, as I said, it's lower your sights to not just romantic love, but love between intimates. Again, whether one's wife, mother, or whatever the case may be. And there's this passage or this quote that I think really underlines that what you're getting at. On page 301, it's written, Rieux was thinking it was only right that those whose desires are limited to man and his humble yet formidable love should enter, if only now and then, into their reward. So the only reward that you can expect, maybe, or the only reward that one should hope for, is this reward of the passing, fleeting, ephemeral, but nonetheless happiness that love, intimate love, can provide. And that there's no doubt that intimate love is an important part of the human experience. But to suggest that that's the only thing, right, and that we only limit ourselves or lower our expectations to this, it is sort of consistent with your suggestion that Rieux has a transformation. But gosh, is this the most that we can hope for out of life? Are there not other ambitions or perhaps higher things that we can and should look to? No doubt with a certain amount of risk and possibility of failure. But but there's lots to consider here.
I want to ask you a question, shifting gears to Cottard in a second, but in closing this discussion, I think that gets at the fundamental problem of Rieux, in that obviously it's an open question. To do it well, to really analyze Rieux well, would obviously require more time than our podcast can cover. And maybe, again, somebody's got an interesting counter thesis that they can provide. I'm happy to entertain that. But much like we had discussed many episodes ago, it might very well be the case that what Camus is really doing is trying to show us why we can't get on board with any of the characters. Father Paneloux was a flawed character. Theroux is a flawed character. Rieux we see as a flawed character. The real answer might be some amalgamation of them, trying to pull from their virtues while rejecting their vices. And so at the very least, I think the only thing that I can say definitively to anybody who's reading along with us and listening to these episodes, either now as we record them or at some future date, if they discover this podcast, is to realize that it's a much more complicated reading, and there's probably so much more that you and I have missed because we're not obviously scholars of Camus, and people might have different readings of any one of these major characters, but obviously we see why there's a richness to these characters. But to move on, while still staying on this theme of moral cowardice or moral flatness, I want to ask you about Cottard, because it's a crazy bombshell of a story. We see Theroux, one of the last times that we actually see him alive, on the trolley with Cottard. As they're getting off, some government officials ask for Cottard, and he bolts out of nowhere and just leaves his friend and doesn't even say goodnight. We don't see him for a couple of pages, so we get the impression that he fled the city finally, that as the plague was finally ending, they were clearly looking for him, and he realized that he had to flee. When we finally do see him, he's shooting up his own neighborhood. What's going on there? And what do you think drives Cottard to do such a thing?
Yeah, it is indeed a shock, or comes as a shock right near the end of the novel, that this character Cottard engages in effectively a shooting spree and is referred to by others as having gone mad. We don't really know why or even what he's shooting at. I mean, certainly at some people, but it seems to be a sort of indiscriminate act of terror. And there's always been a question mark hanging over Cottard. I mean, we know he was sort of guilty of something. The plague allowed him to flee justice or potential prosecution. We never do discover what that earlier crime was. So there's a guiltiness to his conscience that's referred to. But there's also something, I think, along the lines of love here that is important. In a conversation about Cottard, it's written on page 302 the following, quote, "It is fitting that this chronicle should end with some reference to that man who had an ignorant, that is to say lonely, heart." So there's something about this loneliness, this lack of love, this utter lovelessness in the guilty man, Cottard, that is perhaps connected to his crime. And in fact, earlier on page 280, in that discussion between Cottard and Theroux that you referred to, it's Cottard who's asking Theroux, is this plague over and are things going to return to normal? What does the new normal look like? Does this mean maybe there'll be hang-ups administratively and otherwise? Like, he's wondering whether he can still flee the scene, or rather, if he can still flee justice. And Theroux's response is, well, he's not sure about that stuff. He's in no position to comment on it. But what he's more interested in is, might there be some kind of moral conversion among the people of Iran? Could there be some sort of effect on the hearts of the people? Are they going to love differently after the plague? It's sort of a question we're asking today about what, in the wake of COVID-19, will anything be different? Will anything change? Not just in terms of laws and regulations, but maybe people's perspectives on what's high and good and important. And Cottard responds to Theroux and says, or it's written, to this Cottard rejoined curtly that he wasn't interested in hearts. Indeed, they were the last thing he bothered about. So there's this character Cottard who's totally disconnected from the world of love, intimate love, and various forms of love, even the love of Paneloux, or the love of God that Paneloux suggests. And this seems another way, almost, maybe it is fitting that this bit comes after Rieux's insight into love, that Cottard exemplifies the exact opposite. And it leads him to this madness and terror that, in fact, not only is a separation from others, but a potential annihilation of other human beings.
I think you hit it on the head. We see Father Paneloux have love of God, and during that discussion, we were talking about the Augustinian themes of restlessness, that our hearts are truly restless until they rest in God, as the famous passage from Augustine's Confession says. And what do we find in Cottard? We find a real deep restlessness. We find out what happens when somebody can't truly love. That insight, I think, is really telling, and that seems to be what's driving Cottard, that he's really only concerned with himself. He loves himself to the contempt not only of God, but of his city. We've talked also about what kind of political community is being formed here. The narrator, Rieux, tells us later that he recognizes the family resemblance. Iran finally becomes, if not a city, a new family, because everybody has experienced the same thing. And so that very well might be the case going on with Cottard.
Yeah, well, just one thing to add, though. I mean, let's recall that Cottard is the individual who tried to kill himself earlier on in the novel. So suicide, self-annihilation, or self-destruction was an act he tried to carry out and botched, but was clearly, this sense of self-annihilation was within his own heart. So he neither loved God, nor loved himself, nor loved anyone else, for that matter. And to respond to the remark about Rieux turning away from Cottard, it isn't, I mean, one wonders, is this more representative of Rieux or of who Cottard is? Maybe both. It is written on page 306 that perhaps it was more painful to think of a guilty man than of a dead man. And so the unwillingness of Rieux to look at the guilty man is more, what does this say, rather than looking at the dead man? Not unable to look at Cottard, but certainly able to look and cry over Theroux.
I think the only caution I want to put there is, now that we know that Rieux is the narrator, we know that he doesn't quite have full objectivity in this moment, and so he now needs to analyze himself and why, and so that perhaps, yes, maybe that's what's going on, but again, it doesn't give us the full story, and we want to be cautious of what Rieux now is telling us. But even with all that, It's clear why this book won the Nobel Prize, or at least was part of the prize-winning series of novels that Camus wrote. It cuts to the heart not only of our own experience with COVID-19, but it really zeroes in on what it means to be in civic crisis. At the time that we're recording, there are all sorts of events that we can't discuss with any justice of what's going on in the United States, in Hong Kong, in many other parts of the world in which we see political plague happening in various forms. I think that gets to the very heart of why, even though this book is inspired by the experience of World War II and the Nazis, it's not strictly about them, because it really is about the plague that's affecting us in our here and now, and that these medical plagues like COVID-19 or the bubonic plague are really just analogs for the political plague.
And they never die or disappear for good, as is said in the closing sentence of this text. So indeed, it is a recurring problem on many levels in many places.
That's right. That's right. And so here we are at the end. Are there any concluding thoughts that you have?
Well, I mean, there's lots more that could be said, but I guess, we are out of time, and it's been a pleasure to do this with you, Luke, and have some listeners respond. And we're going to take a short break, to be determined for how long, but we will pick up I think in the future as well.
No later than the fall semester, I think we've agreed. You and I obviously have some things that we need to do over the summer. I have a book on a completely different topic that I need to finish writing, and you have some teaching. This is not our last episode, readers should know about. We have at least one more planned, maybe two. Our working plan is for us to interview some colleagues, as well as one of our listeners, about their reading of Camus and what they took away. So we should have one more episode at a minimum coming out after this, and then we'll take a break, and you and I are going to try to think through some other books that hit this theme of civic crisis and go beyond just the plague, but really get to the heart of what it means to heal or reconfigure a civic society or civil society.
Yeah, and I think, as you remarked to me earlier, if anyone has ideas or suggestions about books along these lines, they should let us know by way of Twitter or otherwise.
Absolutely. And anyone listening that likes this podcast, please remember to actually subscribe, convince your friends to subscribe as well, even though there might not be any new episodes immediately after this one and the next one, but it really does help the algorithm on Apple Podcasts and Google Podcasts. And so hopefully we can grow an audience and get some more feedback before we come back from our break and have a better and more robust group of listeners to engage with as we continue these discussions.
Yeah, indeed. More to be continued. So have a great summer.
Welcome to Pandemic Dialogues from the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University. This series seeks to sustain the intellectual community we built with students, ASU colleagues, and the wider community while our regular speaker events are postponed. We offer the dialogues in two modes: a series of live webinars, each discussing a great work on pandemics and civic crisis, and this podcast, with extended discussion of Camus' novel, The Plague. More on the dialogues and the school is at scetl.asu.edu.
Наш общий хохот славил его рассказы.